Yeah, this is the best Amazing Spider-Man cosplay you're gonna get from me because although I would love to own like a complete replica of the Amazing Spider-Man suit, that stuff's pretty expensive. The Amazing Spider-Man is directed by Mark Webb and is the first film of the second reboot of the Spider-Man franchise. It stars Andrew Garfield as the old Webhead, Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy, aka the greatest love interest in any comic book movie, and many others. Now, over the years, these two Amazing Spider-Man films have been given the reputation of being not very good. In fact, some have even heralded these movies as being some of the worst comic book movies ever put to screen, and honestly, I don't get where all that hatred's coming from. These movies are not that bad. They certainly have their problems, studio interference being one of them, but apart from that, these movies are pretty enjoyable. In fact, I would go out of my way to say that there hasn't actually really been a bad Spider-Man film, as they're all enjoyable in their own right. Well, some more than others. Now, I remember watching this movie back in 2012. I was young, carefree, innocent, but most importantly, I had not seen a superhero film in a good long while. This was mainly due to the fact that as a kid I was bullied for liking superheroes, Spider-Man in particular, and so, as like all kids normally do, they pretend to hate the things they like. And so there I was in the cinema watching this movie, and all of a sudden, the nostalgic memories I had of Spider-Man came flooding back to me. I remember rewatching the 90s animated series reruns. I remember watching the Sam Raimi trilogy, and just everything that I loved about Spider-Man came flooding back to me. So maybe I have a nostalgic reason for liking these movies. I mean, after all, these movies brought me back into the world of superheroes and got me into reading comic books. So yes, maybe I'm a bit nostalgic, but I would also disagree and say that these movies are good movies. I enjoy them. And so, with all that being said, let's just jump straight into this. The film retells the origin of Spider-Man that we all know and love, but since the first Sam Raimi film had come out 10 years prior, the people at Sony, the writers, and director Mark Webb decided to change up the Spider-Man story and tell their own version of the events. They drew influence from the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, and if you've read those comics, you can see a lot of the influences they pulled from directly in this movie. From aesthetics, to fight scenes, to character designs, even the storyline about Peter Parker's parents have been taken directly from the Ultimate Spider-Man comic books. And I think that those elements taken really do enhance the story for this movie, because not only does it show that the people making this movie really enjoy and respect the comic books that they're adapting, but also it just feels really organic, and they started implementing ideas from the books and applied it to this movie. Most notably, the idea that we get to see Peter Parker slowly become Spider-Man. In the director's commentary, Mark Webb stated that the main story for this movie is a boy went searching for his father and ended up finding himself. And in my opinion, I think the film does a wonderful job at showing that. At the beginning, we see Peter discover his father's briefcase, which then leads him to Oscorp, where he gets bitten by the spider, which then leads to Peter acting irresponsibly, resulting in the death of Uncle Ben, which then sends him on a path of revenge, which then ultimately turns him to the path of responsibility, which leads to him becoming Spider-Man. One of the things I find so interesting about this film is that Peter Parker doesn't become the web-slinging hero that we all know and love until the scene on the bridge. Yes, he may have put on the red spandex. Yes, he may have developed the web shooters. Something that I find a little strange, and I'll come back to that. But ultimately, he doesn't become a hero until that scene. Before this scene, his primary drive for stopping criminals was to avenge his uncle, to capture criminals that looked like the same man who killed his Uncle Ben. He was simply out for revenge. He wasn't Spider-Man yet. And to be honest, I love that. It makes the bridge scene even more powerful. By saving the kid on the bridge, Peter stopped being selfish and started to become selfless. This was the moment where Spider-Man was born. This is the scene that solidifies who Spider-Man is, and it also shows us the moment where Peter understands Ben's message that he's been trying to tell him throughout the whole film.
If you could do good things for other people, you had a moral obligation to do those things. That's what's at stake here. Not choice, responsibility.
In many ways, I think that this film does the origin better than the Sam Raimi film does. Especially since in this film, Peter doesn't let the burglar fall out of a window and die, unlike the Sam Raimi film. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the Sam Raimi film, but I just feel like this movie does a better job at showing us Peter Parker becoming a hero. However, with that being said, there are some issues with this movie in terms of its story. There are just so many coincidences that occur just to simply get Peter Parker into the room full of spiders. Dr. Arthur dropping the 00 file, Peter walking to a room full of spiders, and then pulling on a web which then suddenly drops them all on him. It's a very strange sequence to watch. Like, why did he have to sneak into Oscorp? Why not just have him go on a field trip there? It honestly felt like the filmmakers were just changing the origin story and implementing this more conspiracy-esque tone just simply for the sake of change. Now, I'm a little mixed on how the film presents Uncle Ben's death. I like that he actually went out looking for Peter after their argument they had, but after that, his actual death scene is really stupid. So, the robber steals the 6-pack of beer. He runs into Uncle Ben, he trips, he drops the beer, his gun falls out in front of him, Ben then tries to tackle him only to get shot. And the worst thing about this scene is that the robber doesn't even pick up the beer he dropped. This scene is just weird, plain and simple. The only thing that saves this scene is Garfield's performance when he sees Uncle Ben dead on the streets. Now, there's an alternate scene of Ben's death in the special features, and it's so much better than the one we got in the film. Honestly, this movie would have benefited from it being in the final cut. That's kind of funny. You can basically apply that to both of these amazing Spider-Man films. Now, coming back to what I said earlier, Peter creating the red and blue Spider-Man suit just to find his Uncle Ben's killer was just really weird, and it makes no sense. Like, why does he create this costume? I get that he has to wear a mask to protect his identity, but why does he go to the lengths of making a superhero costume? This movie treats this moment like it's meant to be something big and epic, and the montage is big and epic, but in terms of its story, it doesn't make much sense. In regards to the Lizard's villain plot, I think it's done well enough. But then again, I like the Lizard in the comics, but not to the extent where I would revolve an entire film around him. Because in my eyes, there are only really 2 stories that you can tell with the Lizard. 1, Kirk Connors transforms into the Lizard and goes on a rampage. Or 2, he transforms into a lizard and wants to turn everybody else on the planet into giant lizards. And in this movie, they try to do both, and it works well enough. It's not the most groundbreaking villain plot ever, but as they're trying to adapt the first volume of the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, it works well because they basically replaced all the Green Goblin stuff with the Lizard. And the third act is pretty good. Having Spider-Man shot in the leg really adds tension and ups up the stakes, and the crane scene, although very convenient, is a truly epic moment. The way James Horner's score swells and builds in that scene is just so good. Another story thread I quite enjoyed is the idea of the police seeing Spider-Man as a vigilante and them going after him. I feel like it was a very interesting take on the public's perception of Spider-Man. It created a solid conflict between Peter Parker and Captain Stacy, and I think overall it does a good job at slowly dropping the Uncle Ben's killer plot and transforming Peter into a more heroic Spider-Man. It doesn't execute it perfectly, seeing as how both the audience and Peter don't actually get any proper closure to that subplot. But the fact that Captain Stacy illuminates Peter on the sting operation, letting him know that Peter made a mistake in capturing the car thief, is effectively used to let Peter know that he's out of his depths and that he's not behaving as a hero, like he initially believes he is. And I also appreciate how the film resolves this conflict. The moment the two have when he unmasks him in the street is an amazing moment. The way Garfield delivers his lines in this scene, and the way the music in the scene builds, is simply epic.
You gotta let me go.
And the promise Peter makes to the dying Captain Stacy never felt out of character for George Stacy, because throughout the film we've seen that he's very protective of his daughter. But it's also a double-edged sword, as it makes Peter Parker look like a bit of a dickhead for breaking a promise to a dying man. But once again, Garfield's performance really enhances the scene. The semi-muted roar he lets out as Captain Stacy passes is just such a powerful moment. And remember, just in this one movie, Peter Parker's already lost 3 father figures. His actual father, Uncle Ben, and now Captain Stacy. Honestly, this film and its sequel perfectly highlights the tragedy and loss that Peter Parker faces and has to overcome in order to be Spider-Man. Now, with all that being said, I can't finish talking about the story without having mentioning... This film has so many deleted scenes and is filled with so much studio interference, and you can really tell. The film was marketed to be the untold story of Spider-Man, But what we get in the final cut is essentially the same story we got from the Raimi Spider-Man films. And this ultimately ends up being the case because everything new that they wanted to add was removed in post-production. It's clear that obviously in the original cut and script of this movie, Dr. Arthur played a much more important role and was linked to this conspiracy regarding Peter's parents. And even then, Peter Parker's parents originally had a much bigger role in the story, which is heavily evident from the trailers and deleted scenes for this movie. Now, I'm honestly intrigued about how this film would have turned out if Sony hadn't meddled with this movie too much. I mean, Mark Webb is a talented filmmaker, and I would have loved to have seen what he would have actually done with this movie. But with that being said, I'm ultimately not a fan of the idea that Peter Parker was destined to be Spider-Man. It takes away from the fact that, in all honesty, the bug bite was random. Every time the comics try to change that, it just feels a bit stupid. Like when you add in the spider gods and the spider totems, no, that's not Spider-Man, that's just weird. Especially since it just takes away from the idea that anybody could be Spider-Man.
Wanna what?
I don't know. Just,
Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker is simply fantastic in my opinion. In fact, I think he might be my favourite on-screen Spider-Man. Now, don't get me wrong, I like Tobey Maguire, I think he did fine in the original Raimi trilogy, but he never felt like Spider-Man to me. And Tom Holland, I love the guy, and I really like his iteration in the MCU, although obviously that has its pros and cons, you know, him being Tony Stark's ward and all that stuff, but nevertheless, I like Tom Holland in the role, but there's something about Andrew Garfield that's just so different, and it just connects with me. He's likable, he's intelligent, he's charmingly awkward, and not only that, he seems way more youthful than Tobey Maguire ever did, which is strange considering the fact that Andrew Garfield was older when he filmed this movie than Tobey Maguire was when he filmed the first Sam Raimi movie. And he acts just like how Peter Parker does in the comic books. Plus, he just has amazing hair. But there's also so many physical details and nuances that Garfield includes in his performance. Like at the beginning of the film, in the scene in his bedroom, it sort of implies that he's OCD, and when he's Spider-Man and he's in the costume spewing jokes, I buy it. This kid is funny. We see him cracking jokes with Aunt May and Uncle Ben all the time. Especially when compared to Tobey Maguire, because when Tobey Maguire was spewing jokes, it never felt right because it just felt out of character. Yes, he dresses like a hipster at times, yes, he comes across as unlikable at times, but that's sort of the point. Even in the comics, before Peter learnt the lesson of responsibility, he was always quiet and unlikable. And to all those saying that Andrew Garfield is too good looking to play Spider-Man, I don't get where you're coming from. In the comic books, Peter Parker is an attractive guy. His love life clearly shows this. When he goes to college, he's going out on dates with Gwen, with Mary Jane, with Betty Brant. All the girls love him. He's a ladies' man. But also, Andrew Garfield just looks like Peter Parker. It's scary how those two look so similar. I mean, you compare him to any comic book version and whoa, it's scary how similar they look. Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy. I adore Emma Stone in general, but this movie made me fall in love with her. She's just so likable, charming, and just perfect for the role of Gwen Stacy. Even though the film doesn't even revolve around her that much, it still takes its time to actually show her little personality quirks and the way people interact with her.
Chocolate house.
She's not one of those shallow interests you see in other comic book movies, especially in the MCU. She's no Jane Foster, and she's no Betty Ross. She has so many little personality quirks that's just so charming. I also love Gwen Stacy's strong sense of will. The way Emma Stone plays it, she makes it look effortless. And obviously one of the biggest praises of this movie is her relationship with Peter Parker. Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone have excellent chemistry. Just saying that phrase right there just seems like such a cliche because their romance in this movie is so good. The scene where Peter asks her out in the hallway is so awkward yet so charming, and the scene that precedes it, you know, the skateboard montage with the Coldplay song playing over it, is just one of my favourite scenes in the film. Not only is it a recreation of the scene from the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, but it really puts you inside Peter's headspace at that moment in time. Side note, did anybody notice that Peter Parker magically changes clothes in between the scenes? In this shot, he's wearing his khaki jacket. Then in the skateboard montage, he's wearing his outfit. And then in the next scene, he's wearing his khaki jacket again. Did Peter change his clothes just for that one scene? Now, the story decision to have Peter Parker reveal to Gwen Stacy that he's Spider-Man was honestly a genius move. Not only does the way the film presents it feel organic, but it also avoids the melodrama that we got with Peter and Mary Jane's relationship in the Sam Raimi movies. It also allows Peter someone to actually talk to out of the costume. The scene between the two of them in Gwen's room is a key example of this, as it allows us to finally see Peter understand Ben's message of responsibility, and complete his journey in becoming Spider-Man. Rhys Ifans as Dr. Connors did a good job for what he was given. I mean, he wasn't given that much to sink his teeth into, especially since they took away a lot of the things that made the character of Dr. Connors in the comics interesting. I mean, in the movie, Dr. Connors is basically reduced to a scientist who wants to regrow back his limb. And yes, it's slightly compelling, but it's just not as compelling as it is in the comic books. I think that by removing the family dynamic Curt Connors has in the comics in this movie, really just lessen the impact of the character, especially since one of the most compelling things about Connors trying to regrow his arm is that he wants to be able to hold his son. But the mentor-mentee relationship that he develops with Peter is really interesting, and it's well presented on screen. Now, I wouldn't say that this interpretation of the Lizard is horrible, but I wouldn't say that he's that amazing either. He's fine. The overall design for the Lizard is fine, although I would have preferred him to have a snout and wear his infamous lab coat for more than just a few seconds. Now, Sally Field as Aunt May and Martin Sheen as Uncle Ben were just perfect casting. They were funny, they were caring, and they just felt like great representations of their comic book counterparts, specifically the ultimate versions of Aunt May and Uncle Ben. I also think that in this film they feel a lot more like Peter's surrogate parents than they did in the Raimi movies, especially when you get wonderful and heartwarming scenes like this.
Uncle Ben. You're a pretty great dad, right?
Just simply the look on Uncle Ben's face is just so heartwarming. And as I said before, I liked Dennis Leary as Captain Stacy. He was entertaining, and he felt a lot like his Ultimate Comics counterpart. And the supporting cast for this film were solid in my opinion. I especially adored this film's interpretation of Flash Thompson. The fact that this movie was able to organically turn Flash Thompson from Peter Parker's bully to a friend by the end of the film was amazing. Especially since it took like 30, 40 issues in the comic books.
Uh-oh. Somebody's been a bad lizard.
This movie simply looks amazing. The visual effects, although 7 years old, still look spectacular and hold up to this day. I mean, the fights between Spider-Man and the Lizard are just jaw-dropping. In fact, the action in this movie is pretty great all round. I really like the more gritty parkour elements they added into the choreography. It just helps add realism to the action scenes. The fight in the high school just has to be my favourite. The way Spider-Man and the Lizard move throughout the fight is awesome. The Lizard is more hulking and powerful and uses his tail in creative ways, whereas Spider-Man is faster, more nimble, and uses his agility to his advantage. Oh, it's just so good. And this movie has probably the best Stan Lee cameo ever put to screen. The colour palette for this movie is a little too desaturated for my taste. I mean, the reason why it is was because Sony wanted to go for the more Batman Beginsy-esque colour grading, but I feel like if this film had a bit more colour, it would look much more pleasing. But other than that, the cinematography for this movie is amazing. And oh boy, that final swinging scene was just incredible. It's easily the best of the final swings. Just the way Spidey is moving and the camera is moving throughout that scene is just phenomenal. Now, I love pretty much all of the Spider-Man themes we've gotten throughout the years, and this film is no exception. James Horner's main Spider-Man theme is epically heroic, the love theme he made for Peter and Gwen is beautiful, and I just love the more soothing and comforting piano pieces. Composer James Horner created these very soothing yet pensive musical cues with the piano, and I just love it. It really helps to build and create an atmosphere in this movie. I especially adore the track, The Briefcase. However, with that being said, I also feel like this film has a couple of musical cues that just feel a bit out of place. The music that plays in the basketball scene is a little too cartoony. I get that it's trying to emphasize the more trickster-like quality of Peter Parker, but the way the music plays, it just feels a little bit out of place. It's a good track, don't get me wrong, but in terms of the scene, it just doesn't really fit it. But with that being said, I love the soundtrack for this movie. Overall, despite all of its flaws, I love The Amazing Spider-Man. I love the characters, I love the performances from the actors. Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone really do just shine in this movie. The action is incredible, the score is for the most part effective, and despite some of the story issues I've mentioned, I really do enjoy this interpretation of Spider-Man's origin. This film may be flawed, but I love it regardless of all its flaws. But yeah, that's what I think on The Amazing Spider-Man. I love it. But what do you guys think? Leave me a comment down below, a like and subscribe and all that good stuff. Hit the notification bell down there. My social media links are down in the description, so if you give them a look and a follow, that'd be very nice. I also have a second channel where I make short films, that's also in the description. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Until we meet again, I'll see you guys next time.